Lightning splits the sky above Cedar Grove, illuminating a rusty chain snapped clean by desperation and divine timing. Through sheets of merciless rain, a shadow moves with purpose. A dog, once abandoned, now free. As thunder rolls across rooftops, he pauses at doorsteps where hope has grown thin, his bark cutting through the storm's fury. What begins as one dog's bid for freedom transforms into a night of miracles, a lost child found, a widow's grief lifted, a disaster prevented. While the tempest rages, strangers emerge from their homes carrying lanterns and blankets, following this unlikely guardian through flooded streets. Each stop reveals another soul in need, another life touched by this four-legged angel. But what compels a creature who has known only cruelty to spend his first moments of freedom helping others? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The abandoned lot at the corner of Maple and Pine had been a source of quiet shame for Cedar Grove's residents for nearly a decade. Behind its crooked "No Trespassing" sign, weeds push through cracked concrete, and memories of the old Harrison hardware store faded like the ghost of its painted sign on the remaining brick wall. But it was the dog, a shepherd mix with eyes, that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries, that truly haunted the space. Nobody quite remembered when he first appeared, chained to a rusted pipe near the back of the lot. Some said he belonged to old Mr. Harrison's nephew, who'd promised to return, but never did. Others whispered he'd been left by one of the migrant workers who passed through town during harvest season. The truth, like many things in Cedar Grove, had been buried beneath layers of speculation and time. The chain was long enough to allow the dog to pace a semicircle of worn earth, but short enough to keep him from reaching the sidewalk where children would sometimes stop to stare. His water bowl, a dented metal pan, collected rainwater and leaves. The concrete foundation of the old store offered minimal shelter from summer sun and winter winds. Mrs. Chen from the Golden Dragon restaurant across the street was the first to notice his quiet dignity, while others saw a nuisance, another sign of the town's slow decline. She recognized something in his patient gaze. Each morning, before opening her restaurant, she would leave a small offering of leftover rice and meat scraps just within his reach. She never approached too close, never made eye contact. It was their unspoken arrangement. That dog's a menace. Howard Thompson, the retired postal worker, would complain at town council meetings. What if he breaks free? What about liability? But the council had bigger concerns. The struggling Main Street businesses, the exodus of young people to bigger cities, the growing distance between neighbors who'd once known everything about each other's lives. The dog watched it all with those knowing eyes. He watched as Emily Parker walked past each morning, her widow's grief wrapped around her like an invisible shawl. He saw Giuseppe, the aging baker, arrive before dawn, to keep his father's tradition alive in a town that increasingly preferred supermarket bread. He observed Katie Parker, Emily's 12-year-old daughter, who would sometimes stand across the street, her phone forgotten in her hand, staring at him with a mixture of pity and fascination. Through summer heat and winter frost, the dog remained a constant presence. His bark, heard mainly at night, became part of the town's soundtrack, along with the 6 a.m. church bells and the distant whistle of freight trains. Some residents claimed he only barked to warn of approaching storms or when strangers lingered too long near parked cars. Others insisted he was simply mad, driven to insanity by years of confinement, but Mrs. Chen knew better. Each morning, as she placed his food, she would catch a glimpse of something in his eyes, not madness, but a deep well of understanding. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sunrise, she would whisper to him in Mandarin, telling him about her own journey from a small village in Fujian to this quiet American town. "We are both watchers, you and I," she would say, "both waiting for something to change. And change was coming to Cedar Grove, riding the winds of an autumn storm that would test the rusty links of an old chain and the stronger bonds that held a community together. As the first distant rumbles of thunder echoed across the valley, the dog raised his head, his ears alert, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. In the gathering gloom, Mrs. Chen paused in her evening preparations, watching through her restaurant window as the first heavy drops began to fall. Emily Parker stood at her kitchen window, one hand wrapped around a cooling cup of chamomile tea, the other clutching the silver frame of her wedding photograph. The image, taken 15 years ago on the steps of Cedar Grove Methodist Church, showed a younger version of herself beaming beside Thomas, his firefighter's uniform crisp and new. She could still smell the fresh starch of his collar, still feel the weight of her bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. The wind rattled the window panes, drawing her attention back to the present. The storm was building faster than predicted, the kind of autumn tempest that could strip leaves from trees and memories from their careful hiding places. On nights like these, she found herself falling into old habits, listening for Thomas's heavy boots on the porch, waiting for his key in the lock after a long shift. But Thomas wouldn't be coming home. Not tonight. Not ever. The apartment fire that took him 3 years ago had left her with nothing but photographs, and a daughter who grew more distant with each passing season. Katie, now 12, had her father's stubborn chin and his way of holding grief like a secret behind clenched teeth. Tonight, Katie's bedroom door remained firmly shut, their latest argument still echoing in the hollow spaces between them. "I hate it here," Katie had shouted, her words carrying all the fury of adolescent despair. "Everyone treats me like I'm made of glass, like I'm going to break just because Dad—" She hadn't finished the sentence, but Emily heard the unspoken words. "Just because. Dad died saving strangers while leaving us behind." The old grandfather clock in the hallway, another remnant of Thomas's passion for antiques, struck 8 with a somber resonance. Emily moved through the darkening house, checking windows, securing latches. These small rituals of preparation were something she could control, unlike the storm gathering outside or the growing distance between mother and daughter. A flash of lightning illuminated the street, and for a moment, Emily caught sight of the chained dog in the abandoned lot. He stood alert, head raised against the wind, as if sensing something beyond the approaching storm. Emily had always felt a strange kinship with the creature. They were both watchers, both tethered to spots they hadn't chosen, both waiting for something to change. The sound of a door opening upstairs made her pause. Katie's footsteps, lighter now than when she was small, moved across the floor. Emily held her breath, hoping her daughter might come down, might seek the comfort of company as the storm approached. Instead, she heard the bathroom door close, followed by the rush of running water, another flash of lightning, another glimpse of the lot. But this time, something was different. The dog's familiar silhouette was missing from its usual place. Emily pressed closer to the window, squinting through the sheets of rain that had begun to fall in earnest. There, a movement near the old brick wall, a shadow pulling against shadow. The wind rose to a howl, driving rain against the windows with such force that Emily stepped back. Over the storm's fury, she thought she heard a sharp crack, like metal giving way under tension. When the next lightning flash came, she saw it clearly. The chain hung empty, swaying in the wind. The dog was gone. A sudden crash from upstairs shattered her contemplation. "Katie!" she called, her voice tight with maternal instinct. No answer. "Katie!" She took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart pounding against her ribs. The bathroom door stood open, the window beside it flung wide, curtains dancing in the wind and rain. On the floor lay Katie's phone, its screen cracked but still glowing with an unsent text message. "I can't stay here anymore. I'm sorry, Mom." Emily gripped the windowsill, leaning out into the storm. Through the curtain of rain, she caught a glimpse of a small figure running down the street, away from the warmth and safety of home, away from the grief that filled every corner of their life. into a night that was quickly becoming dangerous for anyone, let alone a 12-year-old girl carrying nothing but her father's memory and her mother's fear. Behind her, the grandfather clock began to chime the quarter hour, its steady rhythm, a counterpoint to the chaos of the storm. Emily pulled back from the window, her decision already made. She would find Katie, bring her home, break through the walls between them, or die trying, just as Thomas had died trying to save others. As she rushed down the stairs to grab her coat, she didn't notice that the chained dog, now free, had begun to move through the storm-swept streets with purpose, as if following a map that only he could see. Giuseppe Marino's hands moved through the familiar motions of bread-making, his arthritic fingers finding comfort in the rhythm of kneading dough. At 72, he was the last of Cedar Grove's traditional bakers, carrying on his father's legacy. In a world that increasingly preferred the convenience of mass-produced loaves, the antique gas oven that dominated the back wall of his kitchen had been installed by his father in 1962. Its pilot light, a constant companion through countless pre-dawn hours. This morning, something felt different. Perhaps it was the storm pressing against the bakery's windows with unusual ferocity, or maybe it was the strange metallic odor that seemed to hover just at the edge of awareness. Giuseppe paused in his work, flour-dusted hands resting on the marble countertop, and listened to the building creak and groan around him. The old oven ticked quietly, its familiar sound almost lost beneath the storm's rage. Giuseppe had been meaning to have it serviced, another expense he could barely afford, but finding someone who understood these vintage machines grew harder each year. Like so many things in Cedar Grove, it was a relic of a passing era, holding on through sheer stubbornness and routine maintenance. A violent gust rattled the front door, making the bell above it chime softly. Giuseppe glanced at the clock. 4:15 a.m. 2 hours until his first customers would arrive, seeking the comfort of fresh bread and the warmth of his small cafe. Among them would be Emily Parker, ordering her usual whole wheat loaf and coffee. Her quiet grief as much a part of her now as her auburn hair or gentle smile. The metallic smell grew stronger, mixing with the yeasty aroma of rising dough. Giuseppe frowned, moving toward the oven with slow, careful steps. His nose, trained by decades of detecting the perfect moment to pull a loaf from the heat, told him something wasn't right. The scent reminded him of his brother Marco's garage, the sharp, dangerous smell of gas. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the kitchen in stark white. In that instant, Giuseppe saw movement through the front window. A large dog, soaking wet, standing perfectly still on his welcome mat. Those eyes, which he'd seen so many times from across the street, now stared directly at him through the glass, intense and purposeful. The dog barked once, the sound barely audible through the storm, then again, louder, more insistent. Giuseppe had never heard the creature make such a racket. In all the years it had been chained in the lot, its barks had been rare and usually significant. Mrs. Chen claimed the dog only barked to warn of danger. Warning. The word triggered something in Giuseppe's mind, connecting with the metallic smell that now seemed to fill the entire kitchen. He moved faster than he had in years, following his nose to the ancient oven. The pilot light flickered eerily, and now he could hear it, a faint hissing sound coming from behind the massive appliance. The dog's barking grew more frantic. Through the window, Giuseppe could see it pacing back and forth, stopping occasionally to stare at him with an almost human intensity. The animal's urgency sparked a memory. His father's voice, stern and clear, teaching him about the dangers of gas leaks, about the importance of proper ventilation, about how a single spark could... His hands trembled as he reached for the main gas valve, forcing it clockwise until it wouldn't turn anymore. The hissing slowly faded, but the smell remained. Heavy in the air, the storm chose that moment to knock out the power, plunging the bakery into darkness, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning. Giuseppe fumbled for the flashlight he kept beneath the counter, his heart pounding against his ribs. The dog's barking had stopped. When lightning next illuminated the street, Giuseppe saw it standing at the corner, looking back at him expectantly. Then it moved forward a few steps, stopped, and looked back again. In 50 years of baking, Giuseppe had learned to trust his instincts. Those same instincts now told him to follow this strange creature that had possibly just saved his life. He grabbed his rain jacket from its hook, hands shaking as he pulled it on. The door's bell chimed one final time as he stepped out into the storm. The dog waited until Giuseppe had locked up, then began trotting purposefully down Main Street. The baker followed, his old legs protesting as he tried to keep pace. The rain blasted his thin white hair to his scalp, but he barely noticed. His mind was fixed on the mystery of this animal, a creature that had broken free of its chains, only to race through the storm, warning of danger. Behind them, the darkened bakery stood silent, its ancient oven cooling, its unfinished loaves forgotten on the counter. The gas leak, though stopped, had left its mark. The morning's bread would not be baked, routines would be broken, and Giuseppe Marino would find himself drawn into events that would reshape not only his life, but the very fabric of Cedar Grove itself. Katie Parker hadn't planned to run away on a night like this. The storm had taken her by surprise, much like the surge of emotion that had driven her to climb through the bathroom window. Now, clutching her father's old firefighter badge in her pocket, the only thing she'd thought to grab, she pushed through curtains of rain that turned familiar streets into a maze of shadows and uncertainty. Her sneakers squelched with every step, and her hoodie, soaked through, felt as heavy as the guilt weighing on her conscience. She thought of her mother standing at the kitchen window, probably already sick with worry, but she couldn't go back, not yet. The house had become too full of ghosts, too crowded with unspoken words and careful silences. Lightning split the sky, and in that brief illumination, Katie realized she'd wandered into the industrial district near the old mill, the abandoned. Buildings loomed over her like sleeping giants, their broken windows staring down like vacant eyes. Her father used to tell her stories about fighting fires here, back when the mills still ran and Cedar Grove had a future to believe in. "You have to respect the weather, Katie girl," he'd say during storms like this. "Nature doesn't care about your plans." She could almost hear his voice now, mixing with the thunder, telling her to find shelter, to be smart, to stay safe. But Dad wasn't here anymore. He'd left them both, rushing into that burning apartment building because that's what heroes did. Sometimes Katie hated him for being a hero. The wind changed direction, driving the rain horizontally, forcing her to shield her eyes. When she lowered her arm, she found herself facing an unfamiliar alley. Water rushed through it like a small river, carrying debris and reflecting the occasional flash of lightning. Katie turned to retrace her steps but stopped short. In the darkness and rain, every direction looked the same. A sound cut through the storm's fury, a bark, sharp and purposeful. Katie spun around, her heart jumping into her throat. Through the rain, she saw a large dog standing at the entrance to another alley. Even in the dim light, she recognized him, the chained dog from the abandoned lot, the one she'd watched so many times from across the street, but he wasn't chained anymore. He stood free, his dark fur slick with rain, those intelligent eyes fixed directly on her. As another flash of lightning illuminated the scene, Katie saw something in his stance that reminded her of her father. A kind of steady purpose, an air of protective authority. The dog barked again, took a few steps toward her, then stopped, looking back over his shoulder. Katie remembered how her father would guide people out of dangerous situations, using that same calm but insistent manner. "Sometimes people panic," he'd explained. "They need someone to show them the way." "Are you showing me the way?" Katie whispered, feeling slightly foolish talking to a dog. But these weren't normal circumstances, and this didn't seem like a normal dog. When he barked again and took another few steps, waiting for her to follow, she made her decision. The water was ankle-deep now, and Katie could hear emergency sirens in the distance. The dog led her through a series of turns, always waiting when he got too far ahead, always watching to make sure she followed. Unlike the confusing maze of alleys she'd wandered into, his path seemed deliberate, confident. They passed the old textile mill, its brick walls streaming with water, and turned onto what Katie thought might be Marshall Street. Her father's badge felt warm in her pocket, as if giving her courage. The dog stopped suddenly, ears perked, head turning toward a sound Katie couldn't hear over the storm. Without warning, he darted down a side street. Katie hurried to keep up, splashing through puddles, her shoes completely waterlogged. When she rounded the corner, she saw why he'd changed direction. Giuseppe, the old baker, was making his way through the storm, looking as lost as she had been moments before. The sight of a familiar face, even one as surprised as Giuseppe's, made Katie's throat tight with emotion. The baker's eyes widened as he recognized her. "Katie Parker, what in God's name are you doing out in this weather?" His Italian accent, thicker than usual, carried even over the wind and rain. Before she could answer, the dog barked again, more urgently this time. He stood at the far end of the street, his posture tense, expectant. Giuseppe shook his head in wonder. "First he saves my bakery from a gas leak, and now he finds you. This is no ordinary animal, no?" Katie touched her father's badge again, thinking about heroes and how they didn't always look the way you expected. The dog barked once more, and this time both Katie and Giuseppe understood. This night wasn't over, and their guide wasn't finished yet. Together, they followed the dog deeper into the storm-swept streets of Cedar Grove, where more connections waited to be made, more lives waited to be touched by this unlikely guardian angel. Police Chief Isabella Martinez slammed her hand against the cruiser's malfunctioning radio, but the static remained unrelenting. The storm had knocked out communications across most of Cedar Grove, leaving her officers coordinating through cell phones and guesswork. Her own phone showed 3 missed calls from Emily Parker and a text about a missing 12-year-old. "Thompson, do you copy?" She tried again, knowing it was futile. The retired mailman turned part-time dispatcher had reported rising water at the north end of town before the radio went dead. Now, watching Gardner Creek swell beyond its banks, Isabella understood the urgency in his last transmission. 23 years on the force hadn't prepared her for a night like this. Cedar Grove hadn't seen a storm of this magnitude since the flood of '87, long before her time. The rain turned her cruiser's headlights into useless halos, and branches scattered across the roads like fallen soldiers. A figure emerged from the gloom, waving frantically. Isabella recognized Mrs. Chen from the Golden Dragon, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled by wind and rain. "Chief! The dog! He's loose!" The elderly woman's voice carried a note of concern that seemed disproportionate to the news of an escaped animal. "Mrs. Chen, we've got bigger problems than—" Isabella started, but the restaurant owner cut her off with unexpected authority. "No, you don't understand. That dog, he knows things. When the Williams boy fell off his bike last summer, who barked until someone came? When those teenagers were trying to break into cars, who scared them away? He's not just any dog." Isabella had heard the stories, of course. In a small town like Cedar Grove, even a chained dog could become legend. But legends wouldn't help her locate a missing child or manage the rising floodwaters that threatened the lower town. Her radio crackled suddenly to life. "Chief?" Thompson's voice fought through the interference. "We've got multiple reports. Dog leading people. Katie Parker spotted near the old mill. Giuseppe Marino. Gas leak at the bakery." The fragments of information clicked together in Isabella's mind like puzzle pieces finding their places. The dog Mrs. Chen spoke of wasn't just loose, it was moving through the storm with purpose, connecting isolated emergencies into a pattern only it seemed to understand. "Mrs. Chen, which way did the dog go?" Isabella's question held new urgency. The older woman pointed toward Main Street, where the old buildings hunched against the wind like elderly giants. He was leading Giuseppe and the Parker girl, heading east. They looked like they were following him somewhere. Mrs. Chen's dark eyes held a quiet certainty. In my village, we had stories about guardian spirits taking animal form during times of crisis. Perhaps Isabella didn't have time for folklore, but she'd learned long ago not to dismiss local knowledge. Get inside, Mrs. Chen. Stay safe. She reached for her phone, sending a rapid series of texts to her officers. Look for the dog. Follow if spotted. Multiple situations possibly connected. Through her windshield, lightning illuminated the town she'd sworn to protect. Cedar Grove wasn't just a collection of buildings and streets. It was a web of relationships, histories, and unspoken understandings. Tonight, that web was being rewoven by the most unlikely of guides. Her radio sputtered again. Chief, multiple. Residents reporting gathering at intersections, following lantern lights through the storm. Thompson's voice faded in and out, but the message was clear. Cedar Grove was waking up, its people emerging from their homes despite the danger, drawn into the night by something more powerful than fear. Isabella threw her cruiser into drive, tires spraying water as she turned toward Main Street. In her rearview mirror, she glimpsed Mrs. Chen watching her go, hands clasped as if in prayer. The restaurateur's words echoed in her mind. He knows things. Perhaps, Isabella thought, this was what Cedar Grove needed. Not just emergency responses and evacuation plans, but something to bring them together, to remind them of connections forgotten and bonds left untended, even if that something came in the form of a shepherd mix with mysterious intentions and a broken chain. Her radio gave one final burst of static before falling silent again, but Isabella barely noticed. Ahead, through the curtain of rain, she caught a glimpse of movement, a dark shape moving with deliberate purpose, followed by what looked like a growing procession of flashlight beams and lanterns. The night was far from over, and somewhere, in her town, a most unusual guide was leading her people towards something she couldn't yet understand, but somehow knew she needed to trust. The old town bell hadn't rung for an emergency since the textile mill closed in '95, but tonight its bronze voice carried through the storm, calling Cedar Grove's residents from their homes. They emerged like figures from an old photograph coming to life. The Henderson twins from the hardware store, carrying rope and flashlights, Sarah Miller, the school nurse, with her medical bag, even old Reverend Hayes, leaning on his cane but determined to help. They gathered at street corners, sharing umbrellas and information, their voices mixing with the wind and rain. The Henderson twins had seen the dog leading Giuseppe and Katie Parker past their store. Sarah Miller reported movement near the creek, where water threatened to breach its banks. Each sighting of the shepherd mix drew more people into the growing search party. "Remember the summer of '82, Reverend Hayes called out to the group assembling near the town square, when Johnny Mills went missing in the state forest? Lightning flashed as he spoke, illuminating faces both young and old. The whole town and came together then, searched 3 days straight until we found him. "This is different, Reverend," Tom Henderson replied, checking the batteries in his flashlight. "We're not just looking for one person. That dog, he's leading us to something bigger." The old minister nodded, understanding dawning in his weathered face. Through the rain-slicked streets, lanterns bobbed like fireflies, forming constellations of light that mirrored the web of connections being rewoven through the town. At each corner, groups merged and split, following reports of the dog's movement, sharing stories of its history in their community. "He always barked when my Marcus tried to sneak out," said Louise Watson, a widow who lived across from the abandoned lot. "Saved me countless nights of worry." Others nodded, adding their own memories. The dog's warning before the Martinez boys' seizure, its bark that had alerted passers-by to Mr. Peterson's fall last winter. The storm's fury seemed to strengthen. their resolve rather than dampen it. These were people who remembered when neighbors meant more than just adjacent addresses, when community wasn't just a word in the town charter, but a living, breathing thing. Sarah Miller organized the volunteers into search patterns, her experience, with school emergency drills proving invaluable. The Henderson twins distributed their hardware store supplies, ropes, flashlights, first aid kits. Even Mrs. Chen had reopened her restaurant, turning it into an impromptu command center where hot coffee and soup helped warm those rotating in from the search. Above them, the town bell continued its somber song, its rhythm matching the steady purpose of their efforts. Some said later that they heard other sounds mixing with its toll, the bark of a dog carrying through the storm like a beacon, drawing them toward those in need. They found signs of the dog's passage, paw prints in the mud, water disturbed in peculiar patterns, and most importantly, people gathered together who hadn't spoken in years. The Martinez family, who'd lost touch with their neighbors after their son's illness, now stood shoulder to shoulder with the Hendersons, whose father had once testified against Mr. Martinez in a property dispute. "It's like he knows exactly who needs to find each other," whispered Louise Watson, watching old rivals share thermoses of coffee and memories of better days. Not just the people in danger, but all of us. The rain continued to fall, but its rhythm had changed, becoming less violent, more purposeful, as if the storm itself were being transformed by the energy building in the streets below. Through the darkness, Cedar Grove's residents moved with growing confidence, their individual lights merging into rivers of illumination that flowed through the town's arteries. They were no longer just searching for Katie Parker or responding to emergencies. They were rediscovering something lost, something that had been waiting in their midst, chained but patient, watching and understanding with those knowing eyes that had seen through their walls of isolation all along. As midnight approached, the old town bell rang out once more, its sound carrying a different message now, not just warning but awakening. And somewhere in the storm-swept streets, a shepherd mix with rain-soaked fur continued its mission, leading not just with its bark and presence, but with the accumulated wisdom of years spent watching, waiting, and understanding exactly what its town needed most. The brass bell above Giuseppe's bakery door had announced customers for 40 years, but never had its ring carried such urgency. As Chief Martinez pushed through the entrance, followed by 2 firefighters, the old baker's trembling hands struggled with his ring of ancient keys. "The dog knew," Giuseppe kept saying, his accent thickening with emotion, "before I could smell. It myself he knew." Katie Parker stood close to him, her father's firefighter badge clutched tight in her pocket, watching the professionals move through the darkened bakery with their detection equipment. Lightning illuminated the vintage gas oven that had been the heart of Giuseppe's business for generations. In the flash, it looked less like a beloved antique and more like a sleeping giant that had nearly awakened with devastating consequences. "If that dog hadn't warned you when he did," Lieutenant Wilson, one of the firefighters, left the sentence, unfinished as his gas detector's reading confirmed their fears. The whole block could have gone up. Half the old buildings on Main Street share these walls. Katie felt the weight of those words, understanding now why her father had always spoken of fire with such respect. She remembered his voice. "Fire doesn't just destroy buildings, Katie girl. It destroys memories, histories, the threads that hold a community together." The dog waited outside in the rain, sitting perfectly still despite the storm, as if standing guard. Through the window, his eyes reflected each flash of lightning, twin beacons in the darkness. Every few minutes, he would turn his head toward the eastern end of Main Street, bark once, then return to his vigilant watch. "He's trying to tell us something else," Mrs. Chen said softly. She had arrived with thermoses of hot tea, passing them out to the growing crowd of emergency workers and volunteers gathering near the bakery. Listen to how he barks, like he did at the lot when storms were coming. Chief Martinez had learned to trust such observations tonight. Wilson, check the east end of the block. Take Thompson with you. The firefighters moved out into the rain, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Giuseppe sank onto one of his cafe chairs, the weight of what might have happened settling onto his shoulders. "My father always said this oven would outlast us all," he murmured, accepting. "A cup of tea from Mrs. Chen. I should have had it serviced, should have." "Should-haves don't matter now," Mrs. Chen interrupted gently. "What matters is that you listened when warning came, even if it came from an unexpected source." She glanced meaningfully at the dog, who continued his patient vigil outside. The radio on Chief Martinez's belt crackled to life. "Chief, we've got another situation at the east end. Gas main compromise from the storm damage. Need immediate evacuation of the block." The dog barked once more, as if in confirmation, then rose to his feet, shaking water from his coat. His eyes met Giuseppe's through the window with an intelligence that made the old baker catch his breath. "He's not finished yet," Katie said, her voice carrying a certainty beyond her years. "Just like Dad wasn't finished when he got people out of that apartment fire. Sometimes saving one person means saving everybody." The gathered crowd watched as the dog began moving purposefully down Main Street, his dark shape visible in the shaded, storm-thrown shadows. Without discussion, they followed, drawn by the same instinct that had pulled them from their homes earlier in the night. Giuseppe locked his bakery one final time, his hands steadier now. The brass bell chimed a farewell that sounded almost like a promise, not an ending, but a continuation. Tomorrow would bring questions about repairs and inspections, about the future of his business and the building that had been his family's, anchor for 2 generations. But tonight, watching the dog lead their growing procession through the rain-swept streets, Giuseppe understood something that went beyond bread and buildings. Cedar Grove had always been more than its structures. It lived in the connections between people, in the shared histories and mutual care that had somehow gotten buried under years of routine and retreat. As they moved away from the bakery, following their unlikely guide toward the next crisis, the old brass bell gave one final ring in the wind. Its clear tone carried through the storm like a reminder. Sometimes the most important warnings come not from machines or systems, but from those who watch, wait, and understand the true heart of a community. Emily Parker's lantern swung wildly as she pushed through the storm, its beam catching raindrops like falling stars. She'd been searching for over an hour, each minute stretching her fear tighter across her chest. The last time she'd felt this kind of terror was the night Thomas didn't come home, when the police cruiser had pulled up instead of his firefighter's truck. "Katie!" Her voice was swallowed by the wind, but she called again anyway, moving deeper into the maze of Cedar Grove's oldest streets. The lantern's light caught glimpses of other searchers, the Henderson twins checking doorways, Sarah Miller peering into alleys, Reverend Hayes praying quietly as he walked with his small group of volunteers. A peculiar sight made her pause. Fresh paw prints in the mud, larger than a typical dog's, leading purposefully toward Main Street. Following them, she found herself outside Giuseppe's bakery, where a cluster of emergency vehicles cast red and blue shadows through the rain. "Emily!" Chief Martinez's voice cut through the storm. "Katie's safe. She's with Giuseppe. They're helping evacuate the east end." The chief's next words tumbled out in a rush, something about gas leaks and a mysterious dog, and Katie's firefighter badge. But Emily barely heard them. Her daughter was safe, the rest could wait. But as she turned toward the east end of Main Street, Martinez caught her arm. "There's more, Emily. The dog that found her, it's the one from the lot. People are saying, well, you should see for yourself." They moved together through the storm, following the flow of residents carrying flashlights and emergency supplies. Emily noticed something strange about the crowd. Old grievances seemed forgotten, long-standing tensions set aside. The Martinezes, and Henderson's worked side by side, passing out emergency supplies. Mrs. Chen directed traffic while serving hot tea from a thermos, her usually perfect hair plastered to her face by the rain. "It's like the night Thomas died," Emily whispered half to herself. "How everyone came together then." She remembered the casseroles appearing on her doorstep, the quietly paid bills, the neighbors who sat with her through long nights of grief. Somewhere along the way, those connections had frayed, leaving her and Katie isolated in their pain. Lightning flashed, and Emily caught her first glimpse of the dog. He stood at the intersection of Main and Cedar, his posture alert but calm, watching the evacuation efforts with those knowing eyes she'd seen so many times from her kitchen window. As she watched, he turned his head toward a side street and barked once, a clear, purposeful sound. "There!" someone shouted. "Water main break on Pine Street!" Emergency workers rushed to respond, guided by the dog's warning. Emily stood transfixed, understanding dawning in her heart. This creature, who had spent years watching their community from his lonely post, seemed to know exactly what Cedar Grove needed, not just tonight, but perhaps all along. Katie appeared through the rain, helping Giuseppe carry boxes of emergency supplies. She stopped short when she saw her mother, emotions playing across her face like lightning in the sky. Then, without warning, she ran forward and threw her arms around Emily's waist. "Mom, I'm sorry." Katie's words were muffled against Emily's rain-soaked jacket. "I was scared and angry and—" She pulled back, fishing something from her pocket. Thomas's old badge gleamed in her palm. "But Dad's still helping people, isn't he? Through us, through everyone here tonight?" Emily felt tears mixing with the rain on her face. "Yes, baby, that's exactly what he'd want." She looked up to find the dog watching them, his eyes reflecting an understanding that seemed impossible, yet undeniable. The creature that had broken free of its chain was helping them all break free of their own bonds, the invisible restraints of grief, isolation, and forgotten connections. As if reading her thoughts, the dog moved closer, pressing briefly against their legs before turning back to his self-appointed duties. Thunder rolled overhead, but its power seemed diminished now, transformed by the strength of what was building in these rain-swept streets. Emily watched as her daughter rejoined Giuseppe, helping coordinate the evacuation with a confidence that echoed her father's. The old baker caught Emily's eye and nodded, a gesture that carried years of shared understanding. The dog barked again, drawing attention to another urgent need, and the crowd responded as one. Emily found herself moving with them, guided by the same instinct that had driven Thomas toward those in danger. Tonight, Cedar Grove was remembering what it meant to be more than just neighbors, to be a true community, bound together by something stronger than any storm or chain. Howard Thompson's last mail route had ended badly. Retired for 3 years, he'd volunteered to help coordinate emergency communications during the storm, but his truck had slid off Cedar Grove's old postal road, leaving him trapped in a ditch. With a broken ankle and a bag of undelivered letters from his final day of service, kept in his truck as a reminder of the community he'd served for 4 decades. The rain hammered against the truck's roof as he drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain in his ankle keeping time with the thunder. Through the cracked windshield, he watched lightning illuminate the scattered envelopes that had spilled across the muddy ground, last messages that had never reached their destinations. A bark cut through his haze. Howard forced his eyes open to see a familiar shape approaching through the storm, the shepherd mix he'd once complained about at town council meetings. "Well," he muttered through clenched teeth, "guess I was wrong about you being a menace." The dog's bark took on a different tone, more urgent, carrying through the wind and rain. Within minutes, Howard heard voices, saw flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Sarah Miller's face appeared at his window, professional calm, masking her concern. "Howard Thompson, what are you doing out here?" she asked, already assessing his injuries with practiced eyes. Behind her, Giuseppe and Katie Parker were gathering the scattered letters, while Emily Parker held an umbrella over them. Someone had to coordinate. Howard's explanation was cut short by a groan as Sarah probed his ankle. The dog watched from just outside the truck, those knowing eyes fixed on Howard with what seemed like understanding. Letters everywhere. Katie called out, holding up a handful of water-spotted envelopes. "They're from 3 years ago." She began reading addresses, and Howard remembered why he'd kept them. These were the letters he'd never delivered on his last day, when his retirement party had run long, and he'd decided they could wait until tomorrow. But tomorrow had turned into next week, then next month, and finally they'd become a silent reproach in his truck's glove compartment. "Dear Mr. Giuseppe Marino," Katie read from one envelope, "from the National Historic Registry regarding your application for—" Giuseppe's head snapped up, his eyes wide with recognition. "My father's last wish," he said softly, "to have the bakery recognized. I thought they had ignored our application." He took the letter with trembling hands, this message from the past. Finally, finding its way home, Emily was opening another envelope, protected from the rain by Mrs. Chen's umbrella. "Howard, this one? It's from Thomas. Posted the day before he died." Her voice caught as she read. "It's to Katie for her 10th birthday. He must have dropped it in your box that morning." The dog barked again, drawing more helpers to their location. As Sarah coordinated Howard's rescue with the paramedics, others continued gathering the scattered letters. Each envelope revealed another connection, another thread of Cedar Grove's tapestry that had gone missing 3 years ago. "A college acceptance letter for Maria Martinez," someone called out. "Medical school scholarship. Property dispute resolution for the Henderson family. Mrs. Chen's citizenship ceremony notification." The letters, like the dog's actions throughout the night, were weaving together pieces of their community that had fallen apart. Howard watched through pain-blurred eyes as neighbors passed the envelopes among themselves. 3-year-old messages finding their way to their intended recipients, carrying words that might have changed things, might have healed rifts or prevented misunderstandings. "I'm sorry," he whispered. But Sarah Miller shushed him gently. "Tonight isn't about blame, Howard. It's about finding what was lost." She nodded toward the dog, who had moved to stand beside Katie as she read her father's birthday letter by flashlight. "Some things wait until exactly the right moment to be discovered." As the paramedics arrived to transport Howard to the hospital, he noticed how the gathered residents worked seamlessly together. The same people who had grown distant over the years now united in purpose. The dog moved among them, ensuring each letter found its rightful owner, each connection was properly restored. "You knew, didn't you?" Howard addressed the dog as they lifted his stretcher. "All those years watching from that lot, you knew what we were missing." The dog's eyes met his, and Howard could have sworn he saw acknowledgement there. The rain had begun to soften, and in the distance, the first hints of dawn colored the eastern sky. Howard's last sight before they loaded him into the ambulance was of his neighbors standing together, letters in hand, while their unlikely guardian continued his mission of restoration, not just of lost messages, but of the bonds that made. Cedar Grove, more than just a point on a mail route. The dog barked once more, already turning toward his next task, leaving Howard to wonder how many other pieces of their community were waiting to be found, how many other connections needed to be redelivered before this long night's work would be done. The ancient oak tree at the center of Cedar Grove Park had witnessed a century of the town's history, but it had never seen a night like this. Lightning struck its highest branches, sending a thunderous crack through the storm-torn air. The massive tree, weakened by years of drought and disease, began to lean toward the emergency shelter established in the park's community center. Inside, dozens of evacuees from the east end of Main Street huddled together, listening to the storm rage outside. The dog had led them here, moving from house to house with Chief Martinez's teams, ensuring no one was left behind. Now he stood at the community center's entrance, his posture rigid with attention, ears forward, sensing something the humans couldn't yet perceive. He's acting like he did at the bakery, Giuseppe observed, passing out warm bread saved from his kitchen before the gas leak. The dog's sudden bark confirmed his suspicion, sending Chief Martinez and her officers into immediate action. The oak's massive trunk groaned, its roots lifting from the saturated soil. Sarah Miller, organizing medical supplies near the window, saw it first. "Everyone away from the north wall!" she shouted, her nurse's authority cutting through the murmur of voices. But evacuation wouldn't be simple. Mrs. Chen's elderly mother, recently arrived from China, sat in her wheelchair against that very wall. The Henderson twins rushed to help, but the chair's wheels caught on the old carpet. The dog darted forward, grabbed the chair's handle with his teeth, and pulled with surprising strength, helping guide Mrs. Chen's mother to safety moments before. The tree's shadow fell across the windows. The impact never came. Through the rain-streaked glass, the evacuees watched in awe as the great oak settled into a precarious lean, its fall arrested by a network of old support cables that someone had installed decades ago and everyone had forgotten about. "Thomas," Emily whispered, touching Katie's shoulder, "your father put those cables up 5 years ago. Said the old tree had watched over Cedar Grove too long to let it fall." Katie clutched her father's badge tighter, understanding now another way his foresight lived on. The dog's bark took on a new urgency. He moved through the crowd with purpose, nudging people toward the building's south entrance. Chief Martinez's radio crackled to life. "Dam breach upstream, Gardner Creek rising, estimate 20 minutes before—" She didn't need to finish. The dog was already organizing their evacuation, herding people with gentle but insistent guidance. The creature that had spent years watching their comings and goings from his chain now led them with an authority born of long observation and deep understanding. "Follow him," Martinez ordered, trusting now what she'd seen throughout the night. "He knows where it's safe." The evacuation began with practiced efficiency. Neighbors helping neighbors, old grievances forgotten in the face of immediate need. Through the storm they moved, a parade of flashlights and shared umbrellas. The dog led them along higher ground, choosing paths that even long-time residents had forgotten. They passed the old Harrison hardware lot, where the dog's chain still hung, a reminder of limitations now broken. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark bursts. Mrs. Chen supporting her mother, while Giuseppe carried the wheelchair. The Henderson twins helping Howard Thompson's wife Nancy carry boxes of his recovered letters. Emily and Katie walking together, their steps matched, their earlier distance bridged by shared purpose and understanding. The procession wound its way up Cedar Hill, where the old Methodist church stood like a lighthouse above the town. Reverend Hayes waited at the doors, having anticipated their need for shelter. The dog did a final count, moving through the arriving crowds, ensuring no one had been left behind. From the church's heights, they watched Gardner Creek burst its banks, water flowing through the lower streets where they had been minutes before. The community center still stood, protected by Thomas Parker's cables and the warning they'd received in time. "Not just the tree roots giving way," Sarah Miller observed, wringing out her hair. "Everything hidden is rising to the surface tonight." She nodded toward Howard Thompson's letters, now being sorted and finally delivered by volunteers. Toward the Hendersons and Martinezes, sharing a pew and decades-old stories. Toward Emily and Katie Parker, sitting close together, the ghost of Thomas's smile visible in their matching expressions. The dog moved among them, accepting gentle pats and quiet words of gratitude, but never resting for long. Even now, his eyes constantly scanned the crowd, checking, watching, understanding. He had traded one kind of vigilance for another, his chain replaced by a voluntary bond that ran deeper than metal could reach. Thunder shook the church windows, but its threat seemed diminished now. Cedar Grove had faced the storm's heart and found its own heart beating stronger. As dawn approached, the dog sat near the door, his gaze fixed on the eastern sky where the first hint of light would soon appear. The night wasn't over, but its darkest moments had revealed something bright and unbreakable in the heart of their community. The old footbridge spanning Gardner Creek had always been Katie Parker's favorite place to think. Even now, with floodwaters threatening its weathered planks, she found herself drawn there, slipping away from the church's safety, while the adults were distracted by emergency planning. She needed to see it one last time. The place where she and her father had spent so many summer evenings, their feet dangling over the water while he told her stories of past rescues and future dreams. The dog noticed her absence first. His bark alerted Emily, who recognized immediately where her daughter would go. "The bridge," she gasped, remembering too late how Katie and Thomas had called it their thinking spot. Chief Martinez organized a search party, but the dog was already moving, leading Emily through the storm with determined purpose. They found Katie halfway across the bridge, clinging to the railing as wind and rain lashed against her small frame. The structure groaned beneath her feet, its ancient timbers protesting each surge of the flood-swollen creek below. Debris crashed against the supports, tree branches, fence posts, pieces of their town carried away by the torrent. "Katie, don't move!" Emily's voice barely carried over the storm. The dog pressed against her leg, as if holding her back from rushing onto the unstable bridge. His eyes fixed on Katie, watching, calculating. "I just wanted to say goodbye," Katie shouted back. "Dad would have wanted to save it." A massive log slammed into the bridge's support, sending shudders through the entire structure. Katie stumbled, barely maintaining her grip on the rain-slick railing. The dog moved forward, paw by careful paw, testing each board before putting his full weight on it. The wisdom that had guided him throughout the night now focused entirely on reaching Katie. Emily watched, her heart in her throat, as the shepherd mix that had spent years chained in an abandoned lot now inched across a failing bridge to save. Her daughter, behind them, Giuseppe and the Henderson twins arrived with ropes, but the dog's low growl warned them to wait. He understood something they didn't. The bridge couldn't handle any more weight. This rescue would require trust, not force. "Katie," Emily called out, fighting to keep her voice steady, "your father didn't love this bridge. He loved what it represented." The dog was nearly to Katie now, moving with infinite patience. "It was never about the place, baby. It was about the connection, about having somewhere to meet in the middle." Another support beam cracked. Katie whimpered, but the dog's presence beside her seemed to calm her. He pressed against her legs, just as he had done with Emily, offering stability and comfort. His eyes met Katie's, and in them she saw the same steady courage she remembered in her father's gaze. "Like Dad's badge," Katie said, understanding dawning through her fear. "It's not the thing itself, but what it stands for." The dog's tail wagged once, confirming her insight. Then, with gentle insistence, he began guiding her back towards safety, his body providing a buffer between her and the wind. They moved together, step by careful step, while Emily and the others watched in tense silence. The bridge swayed and creaked beneath them, but the dog's confidence never wavered. He had spent years observing this town, learning its rhythms and connections. The bridge's weaknesses were as familiar to him as the strengths of the community he'd watched over for so long. Just as they reached solid ground, the final support gave way. The bridge, Katie and Thomas's thinking spot, the place where father and daughter had built their deepest bonds, collapsed into the raging creek. Katie buried her face in her mother's embrace, but her tears now held something beyond grief. "Dad showed me how to be brave," she whispered, "but I think I needed to learn how to be wise too." She looked at the dog, who sat calmly beside them, despite his soaking fur, like knowing when to let go of something so you don't lose everything. Emily held her daughter closer, understanding that they had been given more than a rescue. The dog had shown them how to navigate not just a physical bridge, but the invisible one between grief and healing, between holding on and moving forward. Giuseppe wrapped a blanket around Katie's shoulders, and the Henderson twins helped guide them back toward the church. The dog followed, pausing only once to look back at where the bridge had stood. Its physical form had been claimed by the storm, but the connections it represented between father and daughter, past and present, memory and growth, remained. Unbroken. As they walked away, Katie reached down to touch the dog's wet fur. "Thank you," she said simply, and in her voice was the beginning of a new kind of strength, one built not on holding fast to what was lost, but on understanding when to build new bridges to what remained. The first ray of sunlight pierced the stained glass windows of the Methodist church, casting pools of color across the worn wooden floors. The storm's fury had finally begun to fade, replaced by a gentle rain that seemed to whisper of renewal. Inside, Cedar Grove's residents stirred from their exhausted huddles, taking stock of what the night had changed, both within and around them. The dog sat near the east window, his fur catching the early light, transforming him from the dark guardian of the night into something almost luminous. He watched as his community, for they were his now as much as he was theirs, began to understand the full scope of what they had accomplished together. "The gas main is secured," Chief Martinez reported, checking off items on her clipboard. "Flood waters are receding. Howard Thompson's stable at the hospital." She paused, looking around the church's main hall. "But I think we all know this night was about more than emergency response." Mrs. Chen nodded, helping her mother adjust in the borrowed wheelchair. "In my village we had a saying, 'Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air.'" She smiled at Giuseppe, who was sharing his last loaf of bread with the Henderson twins. "Sometimes it takes a chain breaking to show us what truly binds us together." The morning light strengthened, revealing faces marked by fatigue but brightened by something stronger than exhaustion. Emily Parker sat with Katie in their usual pew, but there was nothing usual about their posture now. The careful distance they'd maintained since Thomas's death had dissolved, replaced by the comfortable proximity of hearts finally healing together. "Dad would have loved this," Katie said softly, watching the community move around them. "Not the danger, but the way everyone came together." She touched the firefighter's badge, now hanging from a ribbon around her neck. "Like when he used to say that every rescue teaches us something about ourselves." The dog's ears perked up at her words. He rose and began moving through the crowd with purpose, touching each person briefly as he passed. It was as if he was taking inventory, ensuring that the connections forged in darkness would hold in the light of day. "Look at this," Reverend Hayes called out, holding up one of Howard's recovered letters. "The Historical Society's approval for Giuseppe's bakery renovation grant. 3 years late, but maybe right on time." The old baker's eyes welled with tears as he accepted the envelope. "We can help," Tom Henderson offered immediately. "The hardware store's been looking to partner with local businesses. Maybe start with upgrading that old oven of yours?" Similar conversations bubbled up around the church. Mrs. Chen discussed expanding her delivery service to include Giuseppe's bread. Sarah Miller and Emily Parker planned a community health fair. The Martinez family offered their construction expertise to help rebuild the footbridge, stronger this time, with materials donated by the Hendersons. The dog watched it all, his tail gently wagging, his eyes holding that same knowing look that had guided them through the night. When the morning sun finally cleared the eastern hills, painting the church interior in warm gold, he moved to the great wooden doors and scratched once, politely. Chief Martinez understood first. "He's not finished," she said, rising from her chair. "There's more work to be done." The dog's tail wagged faster in confirmation. The community gathered their strength, prepared to face what needed facing. The storm had left its mark on their town. Buildings damaged, roads washed out, the landscape itself altered in places. But it had also revealed something that had been there all along, waiting to be rediscovered. As they filed out of the church, following their guardian down the hill toward whatever needed their attention next, Katie grabbed her mother's hand. "Mom," she said, pointing to where the rising sun had painted a rainbow against the departing storm clouds. "Look where it ends." The rainbow's arch seemed to touch down directly on the abandoned lot where the dog had spent so many years watching and waiting. Its chain now hung empty, transformed by the night's events from a symbol of confinement into a reminder of liberation. The dog paused in his descent, looking back at his people with those wise, patient eyes. The morning light caught his fur, and for a moment he seemed to glow with an inner radiance that spoke of both endings and beginnings. Then he turned and continued down the hill, leading them not just toward the day's work, but toward the promise of what they could become together. The dog's collapse came without warning. One moment he was leading them down Cedar Hill, checking each intersection and alleyway with his usual thoroughness. The next, his leg simply gave out, his great body folding quietly onto the wet pavement. Hours of tireless work through wind and rain, of leading and saving and connecting, had finally taken their toll. Sarah Miller reached him first, her nurse's hands gentle but precise as they moved over his wet fur. "Exhaustion," she announced, looking up at the concerned faces gathering around. "Probably dehydration, too. He's been going all night without rest, without food or water." The same community that had followed his lead through the darkness now moved with unified purpose. Giuseppe shed his coat to create a makeshift bed. Mrs. Chen produced a thermos of warm broth from her seemingly endless supply. The Henderson twins fashioned a stretcher from their emergency supplies. "My clinic's 3 blocks away," Sarah said, already checking the dog's gums and pulse. "We can treat him there until the vet opens." But before anyone could lift the stretcher, Katie Parker stepped forward. "No," she said with quiet authority. "He should come home with us." She looked at her mother, who nodded understanding. They both knew what it meant to carry on past the point of exhaustion, to put others' needs before your own grief. They carried him carefully through streets now painted with morning light. The dog's eyes remained alert despite his exhaustion, checking each face as they passed, making sure his flock was safe even in his moment of weakness. Emily saw in his gaze the same dedicated focus she'd recognized in Thomas during his longest shifts, the unwavering commitment to watch over others, whatever the personal cost. Their house, when they reached it, seemed somehow different in the dawn light. The shadows that had held their grief for so long had been washed away by the storm, leaving space for something new to grow. They settled the dog in the living room, on the old quilt Thomas had loved for Sunday naps. "I'll get fresh water," Emily said, but Mrs. Chen was already heading to the kitchen. Giuseppe had disappeared to his bakery, returning minutes later with a paper bag of fresh bread, still warm from his last batch before the evacuation. Sarah Miller arranged her medical supplies on the coffee table, checking the dog's vital signs. With professional efficiency. "His heart's strong," she reported. "He just needs rest and care." She paused, her hand resting on the dog's thick fur. "Though these old scars tell quite a story." Her fingers found evidence of past hardships. A poorly healed rib, a notch in one ear, the collar marks around his neck where the chain had rubbed for years. "He never let it make him bitter," Mrs. Chen observed, returning with a bowl of water. "All those years watching us, learning our habits, understanding our needs, he was preparing for when we'd need him most." The dog accepted their care with dignified patience, though his eyes still tracked every movement, every shadow. Katie sat beside him, threading her fingers through his fur. "You can rest now," she whispered. "We're all safe. You did it." Something in her words seemed to reach him. The vigilant tension in his body began to ease, his breathing deepening into the rhythm of exhausted sleep. Yet even then, his ears twitched. At each sound, his guardian's instincts never fully at rest. Emily watched from the doorway as neighbors came and went, bringing blankets, food, offers of help. Howard Thompson's wife Nancy arrived with a stack of old mail route maps, spreading them out to mark where flood damage needed attention. The Henderson twins coordinated repair crews via phone. Sarah Miller turned the Parker living room into an impromptu aid station, treating minor injuries as people reported damage and needed help. Through it all, the dog slept, his massive form rising and falling with each breath. Sometimes his paws would twitch, and Katie swore he was still making his rounds in his dreams, checking on his people, ensuring all was well. "You know we can't call him the dog anymore," Emily said softly, settling beside her daughter. "He needs a proper name." Katie nodded, her hand resting protectively on the dog's shoulder. "Guardian," she said simply. "Not very original, maybe, but perfect," Emily finished. "Sometimes the simplest truth is the best name." She watched as Guardian shifted in his sleep, his muzzle brushing Katie's knee as if in blessing. In that quiet moment, Emily understood that while the storm had brought him to their door, it was love that would keep him there. The same love that had held him in that lot for years, watching, waiting, preparing for the moment when his community would need him most. A week after the storm, Cedar Grove's community notice board underwent its own kind of transformation. The usual advertisements for yard sales and lost cats were replaced by something more profound. Photographs of neighbors helping neighbors, sign-up sheets for repair crews, and at the center, a large picture of Guardian leading evacuees to safety, taken by Katie Parker on her recovered phone. The physical cleanup had begun immediately, but it was the invisible repairs that marked the true change in Cedar Grove. Giuseppe's bakery hummed with activity as the Henderson twins installed his new safety system, their good-natured bickering about proper pipe fittings, mixing with the smell of fresh bread. Tom Henderson had insisted on covering the cost. "Consider it back payment," he'd said, "for all the morning rolls you gave our father during the recession." Guardian, still wearing his new name like a well-fitted collar, made his daily rounds of the recovery efforts. He no longer needed to bark warnings. His presence alone seemed to inspire people to look closer, work harder, reach further across old divides. Each morning he would start at the Parker house, waiting patiently by Katie's bed until she woke, then accompanying her on what they called their community patrol. Emily watched these morning departures from her kitchen window, the same window where she'd once stood alone with her grief. Now she saw her daughter walking tall beside the dog who had changed their lives, Thomas's badge gleaming around her neck, her smile returning like spring after a long winter. "She's got her father's way with people," Mrs. Chen observed one morning, delivering coffee and pastries to the volunteer coordination center the Parkers' living room had become. And Guardian's instincts for who needs help most. They watched through the window as Katie and Guardian stopped to help old Mr. Peterson with his fallen fence, the three of them working together, as if they'd done it all their lives. The recovered letters had sparked their own kind of renovation. Maria Martinez, learning of her long-lost medical school acceptance, found the courage to reapply. Giuseppe's historic registry approval, though years delayed, arrived just in time to qualify his bakery for restoration grants. Each delayed message seemed to land at exactly the right moment, as if time itself had conspired with Guardian to deliver hope when it would mean the most. Howard Thompson, his ankle healing at home, hosted an impromptu mail-sorting party. Volunteers helped organize decades of postal records, creating a living history of Cedar Grove's connections. "Think of it as preventive medicine," Sarah Miller had said, bandaging his ankle, making sure no message gets lost again. The abandoned lot, where Guardian had kept his years-long vigil, became a symbol of their transformation. The chain that had held him was carefully removed and preserved, not hidden away in shame, but displayed in the town museum as a reminder. "Sometimes our strongest bonds grow from breaking the ones that hold us back," read the plaque beneath. It, words chosen by Katie during a town council meeting she'd attended with Guardian by her side. In that same lot, plans took shape for a new community garden. Mrs. Chen's mother, whose expertise in traditional Chinese gardening had gone unrecognized for years, now led design committees from her wheelchair. The Henderson twins donated materials, while Giuseppe promised fresh bread for the planning sessions. Even Howard Thompson, still on crutches, contributed his knowledge of which residents had once maintained victory gardens during wartime. Guardian attended every meeting, his calm presence a reminder of the patience needed for true growth. Sometimes he would sit in his old spot, not from habit but from choice, watching his community with the same thoughtful eyes that had observed them through all those years of waiting. But now, when he saw someone in need, he could go to them, offer the comfort of his presence, guide them toward help. "He's teaching us his way of watching," Katie explained to Chief Martinez during a preparedness planning session. "Not just seeing what's wrong, but understanding how to make it right." The chief, remembering Guardian's intuitive leadership during the crisis, made him an honorary member of the emergency response team, complete with a special collar tag that gleamed beside his regular license. Emily found herself hosting more impromptu gatherings, the house filling with voices and laughter in a way it hadn't since Thomas's death. One evening, looking around her crowded living room, Mrs. Chen teaching Katie Chinese characters, the Henderson twins arguing good-naturedly over blueprints, Giuseppe sharing his father's stories with Howard Thompson, she felt Thomas's presence, not as a ghost of grief, but as a foundation for this new kind of family. Guardian lay in what had become his spot by the fireplace, one eye always open, still watching, still guarding. But his vigilance now carried a different quality, less a solitary burden and more a shared responsibility. Every person in that room had learned to see their town through his eyes, to notice not just problems but possibilities, to understand that sometimes the strongest guardians were the ones who taught others to care for each other. As spring rain pattered against the windows, gentle now, healing rather than threatening, Emily saw Guardian's ears perk up, his body tense slightly, but this time, when he rose to investigate, he didn't go alone. The whole room shifted, ready to help, ready to follow their Guardian's lead toward whatever needed their attention next. The town council chamber had never been so crowded. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Guardian sat beside Katie Parker in the front row, his posture as dignified as any official's. The agenda before them was unlike any in Cedar Grove's history: Community Transformation Initiative inspired by the storm. Mayor Richardson, who had been out of town during the crisis, struggled to maintain his usual procedural formality. "The minutes from the night in question are unusual," he admitted, shuffling through Howard Thompson's detailed account. "They include multiple references to, and I quote, divine intervention in canine form." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the crowd. Guardian's tail thumped once against the floor, as if acknowledging the description. "With all due respect, Mayor," Chief Martinez stood, her uniform crisp but her tone warm, "those minutes might be the most accurate we've ever kept." She gestured to the stack of proposals before her. "Everything we're discussing tonight grew from that night's events, and everything that happened then grew from years of patient watching by a guardian who saw what we needed before we knew we needed it. The proposals under consideration would reshape Cedar Grove in subtle but significant ways. The abandoned lot would become the Guardian Community Garden, with Mrs. Chen's mother as head consultant for its design. The Henderson twins presented plans for a tool-sharing program, inspired by how effectively they'd pooled resources during the crisis. Giuseppe stood to discuss the Breaking Bread initiative, which would combine his baking expertise with Mrs. Chen's business acumen. "We think of it as feeding both body and community," he explained, his accent strong with emotion, "using the historic status of the bakery to create a space for gathering, for learning, for remembering that we are all connected." Emily Parker presented the emergency preparedness plan she'd developed with Chief Martinez. "We're calling it the Guardian Protocol," she explained. "It's not just about weather alerts and evacuation routes. It's about knowing our neighbors, understanding their needs, being ready to help before help is asked for." Her eyes met Katie's in the front row, sharing a smile that held no trace of their former grief. Howard Thompson, his ankle finally healing, hobbled to the podium to present the Community History Project. "Every letter that was delayed taught us something," he said, "about connections missed, opportunities lost, but also about how it's never too late to deliver hope." The project would combine his postal records with town archives, creating a living database of Cedar Grove's interconnected stories. The mayor seemed overwhelmed by the scope of community involvement, by the way old antagonists now work together with easy familiarity. "This is all very ambitious," he managed, watching Guardian navigate the crowd with graceful purpose, checking on each person in turn. "Maybe we needed ambition," Katie spoke up, standing beside her mother's chair. "Maybe we needed someone to show us that breaking. Chains doesn't mean breaking apart." She touched her father's badge, now permanently part of her daily attire. "Sometimes it means finding the strength to build something new together." Guardian moved to her side, and Katie rested her hand on his broad head. "Look at where he chose to keep watch all those years," she continued, her voice clear and confident. "Right in the center of town, where he could see everything and everyone. He wasn't just waiting to be freed, he was learning how to help us free ourselves." The council chamber fell silent, absorbing the wisdom in her words. Then Mrs. Chen stood, her usual reserve softened by purpose. "In Chinese tradition," she said, "we believe that when heaven wants to give great responsibility to someone, it first tests their heart with suffering, their muscles with toil, their body with hunger. Perhaps this is true not just for people, but for guardian spirits as well." Guardian's quiet dignity seemed to confirm her words. He had endured years of chain and isolation, watching and waiting, preparing for the moment when his community would need him most. Now his patient wisdom continued to guide them, not through crisis, but through transformation. The mayor looked around the crowded chamber, at faces alight with purpose and possibility. The procedural formality he'd tried to maintain gave way to something more genuine. "I believe," he said slowly, "that we should add one more item to tonight's agenda, a formal recognition of our town's most faithful guardian." The vote was unanimous, as Chief Martinez attached a special citizen's medal to Guardian's collar. The applause was interrupted by his sudden, alert posture. His ears pricked forward, his nose lifted slightly, sensing something only he could perceive. The room fell silent, everyone watching, ready to follow. Guardian rose smoothly, moving toward the chamber doors with purposeful steps, and without hesitation, just as they had on that stormy night, the people of Cedar Grove rose to follow him. Not out of crisis or fear now, but out of trust in the deeper wisdom that had watched over them all along. The mayor's gavel fell quietly on his desk, unneeded. The official meeting might be ending, but Cedar Grove's real work continued, guided by a guardian who had traded his chain for something far stronger, the willing bonds of a community rediscovering its heart. The adoption ceremony wasn't planned as a ceremony at all. It began as a simple trip to the veterinarian's office to update Guardian's records, but somehow the whole town seemed to know it was happening. By the time Emily and Katie arrived with Guardian, the waiting room was filled with familiar faces, each carrying some small token of appreciation for the dog who had changed their lives. Dr. Anderson, the town's only veterinarian, handled the paperwork with misty eyes. "Never thought I'd be documenting the adoption of a local hero," she said, updating Guardian's records, "though I suspect he adopted all of us long before we realized it." Her fingers traced the various medals and tags now adorning his collar. The official emergency response badge, the Citizens Recognition Medal, and now, finally, a proper license with the Parker name. Guardian sat patiently through the proceedings, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the excited energy around him. Mrs. Chen had brought special treats, explaining that in Chinese tradition, new family members were always welcomed with sweet offerings. Giuseppe contributed a basket of dog biscuits baked in his restored oven, each one shaped like a small bone. "These are actually fit for human consumption too," the baker admitted with a wink. "Made with the same care as everything else in my shop." He patted Guardian's head softly. "After all, he's the one who saved both my business and my life." The Henderson twins arrived with a custom-built dog bed, large enough to accommodate Guardian's generous size. "Reinforced corners," Tom explained, "and the cushions stuffed with memory foam left over from the community center renovation." His brother added, "Though he seems to prefer your father's old quilt anyway, Katie." Katie nodded, one hand resting on Guardian's shoulder. The quilt had become his favorite spot in their home, as if he understood its significance to their family. Some mornings, she would find him there, watching the sunrise through the living room window, his vigilant gaze never quite leaving his adopted community. Chief Martinez stopped by during her patrol, carrying Guardian's updated emergency response, a vest. The department added a few features, she explained, showing them the reflective strips and reinforced handles. Though honestly, he probably doesn't need any of it. He knew exactly what to do during the crisis without any special equipment. Howard Thompson hobbled in on his nearly healed ankle, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Found this while organizing the old post office records," he said, handing it to Katie. Inside was a faded photograph showing the abandoned lot before it had been abandoned, when the Harrison hardware store still stood proud on the corner. And there in the background was a much younger version of Guardian's mother, bearing the same watchful expression he had inherited. "She belonged to old Mr. Harrison," Howard explained. "Had the same way of looking after people. When she passed, her pup, our Guardian here, just seemed to take up her post naturally. Some things run deeper than training, I suppose." Emily watched as her daughter absorbed this new piece of Guardian's history, seeing how it completed some puzzle in the girl's mind. Katie had been collecting these stories, writing them down in a journal, preserving the way their community's Guardian had woven himself into the fabric of their lives long before the storm had revealed his true purpose, the tool. Adoption paperwork was simple, but its meaning ran deep. Guardian would officially live with the Parkers, but his role as community guardian remained unchanged. If anything, having a true home seemed to strengthen his commitment to watching over the town he had chosen as his own. "It's not really about ownership, is it?" Katie mused as they walked home, Guardian moving with his usual measured pace beside them. The spring afternoon was warm, and all along their route, signs of renewal were visible. Fresh paint on old buildings, new plantings. In the community garden, neighbors chatting on porches that had stood empty for years. "No," Emily agreed, watching Guardian pause to check on Mrs. Chen's mother, who was teaching a group of children about butterfly-attracting flowers in the new garden. "It's about belonging, about choosing each other." They stopped at the former, abandoned lot, now transformed into a gathering space that somehow maintained the dignity of Guardian's years of watchful waiting. The chain that had held him was gone, but its lesson remained, embedded in the way the community now looked after its own. Guardian surveyed his old post with clear eyes, then turned toward home, not just the Parker house now, but the whole of Cedar Grove, every street and corner where his careful attention might be needed. The new tag on his collar caught the sunlight as he moved, not a mark of ownership, but a symbol of connection, of chains broken and replaced by bonds freely chosen. 1 month after the storm, Cedar Grove gathered to dedicate a simple bronze plaque in the heart of the new community garden. The morning sun caught the metal surface, making the words glow. In honor of Guardian, who showed us that watching over others is the highest form of love. Below the text was an etching of a shepherd mix, alert and watchful, with knowing eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of years. Guardian himself sat beside Katie during the ceremony, his posture as dignified as ever, but somehow more relaxed now, as if the official recognition of his role had allowed him to wear it more comfortably. The chain that had once held him was long gone, but its lessons remained, transformed into something beautiful. The intertwined vegetables and flowers in the garden beds, the new friendships blooming like Mrs. Chen's mother's carefully tended roses, the way people now paused to truly see each other as they passed on the street. Emily watched her daughter stand to address the gathering, Thomas's badge gleaming at her throat. Katie had grown in the past month, not just in height, but in presence. She spoke with a quiet confidence that reminded everyone of both her father's strength and Guardian's patient wisdom. "We thought we were rescuing a chained dog that night," Katie said, her voice carrying across the garden. "But really, he was rescuing us from chains we didn't even know we wore. The chain of isolation, of grief that wouldn't heal, of old hurts we held onto too long." Guardian's tail thumped gently against the ground, stirring the fresh mulch beneath the newly planted memorial tree. Around them, the evidence of Cedar Grove's transformation was everywhere. Giuseppe's restored bakery now hosted weekly community dinners. The Henderson twins had expanded their hardware store to include a tool-lending library, and Howard Thompson's postal history project had become a popular gathering spot for sharing stories and reconnecting. Mrs. Chen's mother, her wheelchair now equipped with special garden tools, demonstrated traditional planting techniques to a group of eager students. The Martinez family had started a weekend construction skills workshop, teaching others how to maintain their historic homes. Even Chief Martinez had instituted what she called Guardian Walks, regular community patrols that focused more on connection than enforcement. "Some people say it was just a series of coincidences," Katie continued, her hand resting on Guardian's head. "A storm, a broken chain, a dog who happened to be in the right places at the right times. But we know different, don't we? We know that sometimes the most powerful guardians are the ones who watch and wait and love us enough to show us how to save ourselves." As if in response to her words, Guardian suddenly stood, his attention focused on the garden's entrance. A young family stood there, newly arrived in town, looking uncertain about joining the gathering. Without hesitation, Guardian moved to welcome them, his gentle presence drawing them into the circle. It was such a simple act, but it captured everything he had taught his community, that watching out for others meant noticing not just their crises, but their everyday needs for connection and belonging. Emily found herself thinking of Thomas, of how he would have loved this transformation of their town. His spirit lived on not just in Katie's growing confidence or in the badge she wore, but in the way Cedar Grove had learned to look after its own. Guardian had somehow helped them all become a little more like Thomas, a little braver, a little more willing to reach out, a little better at seeing what needed to be done. The ceremony concluded with the planting of wildflower seeds around the plaque's base. "These flowers," Mrs. Chen's mother explained through her daughter's translation, "will bloom year after year, like the connections we have planted here." Each person took a handful of seeds, scattering them in the freshly turned earth, while Guardian watched with apparent approval. As the crowd began to disperse, Guardian made one final circuit of the garden, checking on each person, ensuring no one was left out or overlooked. It was the same route he had walked for years from his chained post, but now he moved freely, by choice rather than constraint. His dedicated vigilance had become a gift rather than a burden, freely given and gratefully received. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the bronze plaque and the newly planted garden. Guardian returned to Katie's side, sitting between her and Emily, with a contentment that seemed to radiate outward, touching everyone around them. In that moment, watching their guardian at rest but ever watchful, Cedar Grove understood that some chains, once broken, could forge bonds far stronger than metal, bonds of choice, of love, of willing service to something greater than oneself.